Hello, I'm John Cunningham, and welcome to another episode of the RedChip Money Report. For those of you new to the show, RedChip is an investor relations, media, and research firm focused on emerging growth companies. Our unique platform combines global multimedia with traditional investor relations, reaching investors around the world. Today's show features interviews with executives of two companies. First up is 60 Degrees Pharma, stock symbol SXTP on the Nasdaq. 60 Degrees Pharma is addressing the unmet medical needs associated with infectious diseases throughout the development and commercialization of new small molecule therapeutics. They have successfully achieved regulatory approval of ARAKODA in malaria and are now seeking to demonstrate clinical benefit using the same regimen for COVID-19, tick-borne, and fungal diseases. We'll learn more about the company's expanding development pipeline later in the show when we speak with the CEO. Up next is Reviva Pharmaceuticals, stock symbol RVPH on the Nasdaq. Reviva is a clinical stage pharma company developing therapies that seek to address unmet medical needs in the areas of the central nervous system, cardiovascular, metabolic, and inflammatory diseases. The company has a phase 3 study in acute schizophrenia patients underway, and the FDA has granted orphan designation for Reviva's drug candidate for the treatment of heart disease. We'll learn more when we speak with the CEO later in the show. Now, before we get to our first interview, our quote of the week. It comes from the book Small Stocks, Big Money. If you want to invest in the microcap space, buy companies, not stocks. If you buy stocks, the daily fluctuations and lack of liquidity will drive you crazy. These quotes come from Byron Roth, CEO of Roth Capital, featured in Chapter 7 of Small Stocks, Big Money. This is a book of exclusive interviews with some of the biggest players in the microcap space. Get a digital copy on Amazon today for just $18. Now let's get started with our first interview today with 60 Degrees Pharma.
Hello, today we have Jeff Dow, CEO, President, and Director of 60 Degrees Pharma. Jeff, great to meet you.
Craig, you too. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today.
Jeff, please introduce to us 60 Degrees Pharma and its lead drug candidate, which is addressing that significant unmet need in COVID therapy. How did this leading drug candidate develop from your FDA-approved malarial drug, ARAKODA?
Craig, it's really nice to meet you, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about 60P. We're a Washington, D.C.-based pharma company focused on developing new medications to prevent and treat serious infectious diseases. We have a corporate strategy focused on reaching late-stage clinical and regulatory endpoints, and obviously a pretty important track record in having successfully gotten ARAKODA approved for malaria prevention back in 2018. Now, ARAKODA, which is our branded version of tafenoquine, was approved by FDA for malaria because it offers substantial benefits relative to other products for malaria prevention. And that's primarily a convenient dosing regimen, so it's a once a weekly administered product. And there's also no drug resistance, which simplifies the choice of which medication to take for physicians. Now, moving forward, the active ingredient of ARAKODA, which is tafenoquine, in a number of clinical studies and non-clinical studies, has some really intriguing data in other disease areas, which we think mean that the core molecule tafenoquine can be repositioned for new disease areas. So during the pandemic, we evaluated the approved regimen of tafenoquine, so ARAKODA, the first 4 doses of that in COVID patients. And what we found was in a cluster of COVID symptoms, tafenoquine accelerated clinical recovery amongst those patients that we enrolled. So moving forward, what we want to do is take that FDA-approved regimen of tafenoquine and prove that we can accelerate the clinical recovery from COVID in a phase 2B study.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Now, let me review momentarily here. Malaria, you've got FDA approval. COVID, you're going after it right now, and I just heard you say that you may be going after other infectious diseases with this tafenoquine. Could you elaborate, please?
Yeah, sure, Craig. So just recapping briefly, our lead product, Arakota, is approved for malaria. We're going to be taking that same regimen of tafenoquine that's in Arakota. So a loading dose of 3 days and then a once weekly dosing regimen, and evaluating that for COVID in a phase 2b clinical trial. But that convenient regimen we think may be also very useful in other disease areas. So everyone in the northeastern United States is aware of tick-borne diseases, including Lyme disease. You may not have heard of babesiosis, which is a parasite related to malaria, but it's also transmitted by ticks in the same way that Lyme disease is. In immunosuppressed patients, babesiosis has a fatality rate of about 5% and can be chronic and really debilitating for patients. And typically what happens is those folks will go on 5 different courses of chemotherapy and not resolve their symptoms. There are a number of really exciting case reports in the literature where tafenoquine has been used on a weekly basis and has been basically the only treatment that has cured babesiosis infections. What we hope to do with collaborators in the northeastern United States in 2024 is conduct a phase 2a clinical trial in babesiosis patients to prove that tafenoquine may have or provide some clinical benefit to them. Babesiosis is an orphan disease, so there's some real advantages from a regulatory standpoint, but it's also what we refer to as a gateway indication to a much larger universe of tick-borne diseases that we think that tafenoquine may have some utility in. Separately from that, we're also focusing on candidiasis. You would have heard of Candida auris, which is a hospital-borne infection with a lot of drug resistance. We have some great non-clinical data that show that tafenoquine has an interesting mechanism of action and not any innate drug resistance associated with it. And that different mechanism of action, we think, may provide the opportunity for a clinical program around it in the future.
The addressable markets for all of these infectious diseases that you aim to treat, do you have any idea on the size of them?
Well, for COVID, we've got some pretty good idea of what the overall size of the market is based on the experience that Paxlovid, or I should say Pfizer and Merck, have had with Paxlovid and Molnupiravir. We know that those two products had $12 billion in revenue in 2022, but the way the FDA wrote their labels, they're only really appropriate for treating about 75% of the US population, and that's high-risk folks. For folks who have low risk of disease progression in COVID, you still don't want to get COVID and you still want to get better from COVID. But there's no FDA-approved therapies in the market. So that's why Gilead and 60P and a number of other companies are looking for new therapeutics to fill that gap. And we think that's a multi-billion-dollar unmet medical need. As it relates to malaria, our approved indication, we think there are around 500,000 prescriptions a year that our product, Arakota, could satisfy on an annual basis in the US.
Jeff, talk to us about the data that suggests that the Arakota regimen of tafenoquine for COVID can accelerate recovery.
Yeah, so we enrolled 87 patients in a clinical trial in 2021, and we compared the ability of the first 4 doses of our regimen of Arakota, so that's 2 tablets on day 1, 2, and 3, and then 2 tablets 1 week later. And what we saw was about a 2 to 2.5 day improvement in recovery from a cluster of COVID symptoms, and an overall suggestion from the data that the trend towards therapeutic benefit favored Arakota versus placebo. So what we'd like to do in our next study is basically enroll about 150 patients in a new clinical trial and test Arakota again against placebo, but specifically focusing on measuring the time to clinical recovery in patients taking Arakota versus placebo. And we expect to see a multi-day improvement in that outcome.
Arakota, Jeff, how does it compare to existing treatments such as Paxlovid and Molnupiravir?
So, Paxlovid and molnupiravir do a good job for what they're registered to do. That is, they prevent hospitalization in patients with a high risk of disease progression. But there's actually no evidence, no clinical evidence, that those products will accelerate your recovery from COVID symptoms if you don't have severe disease or you're not at high risk of disease progression. And so there's a gap there in the market that us and other companies are trying to fill with new therapeutics.
What is the strategy and what are the milestones expected as you aim to get this COVID therapy approved and to market? Also, Jeff, what is the expected timing?
So we'll be focused in 2023 on getting a phase 2b study up and running, and that will compare the approved regimen of Arakota for malaria, but testing to see whether that same regimen can accelerate the recovery from COVID symptoms in patients with mild to moderate disease who have a lower risk of disease progression. We hope to get that study started later in 2023, enrolling our first patients before the end of the year, with the goal of completing the study in 2024.
Jeff, of course, you got Arakota approved for malaria in 2018 and to market in 2019. What important lessons did you learn in that process?
I think it's really important to have a small, disciplined, focused team with lots of subject matter expertise and passion for the product you're moving forward. My background is in basically 25 years of drug development in malaria. I'm an expert in this particular product, Arakota and tafenoquine, and I brought many years of experience as an Army contractor with this molecule specifically, and that subject matter expertise, and then just having a small, nimble, efficient corporate environment, I think allowed us to really focus and get the product across the line. Of course, you can't do that without funding. We had a lot of public support from the US Army, as well as backing from a Canadian pharma company, Knight Therapeutics, and a lot of room to just run with the project and make the decisions and calls we needed to make. And it was that combination of, being given the space to do it, well-resourced, and subject matter expertise that got us across the line.
Jeff, as we wrap up today, what is the essential value proposition? Why should investors take an interest in 60 Degrees Pharma right now?
Well, I think we have a lot of credibility in getting products to market. There are very few small companies who can say that with a straight face. We've done it. We've got a product with great data and a plan for new indications of both important unmet medical need for patients, but high value for investors. And we have a track record of reaching important clinical milestones very cost effectively. And it's our goal to do that again with new investors coming into the company in the future.
Now, to get more information on 60 Degrees Pharma, visit SXTPinfo.com. You'll see research reports, fact sheets, presentations, and the latest videos. It's all free. You can even subscribe to email alerts to stay on top of the latest news. You can also call 1-800-RedChip to speak to a specialist if you have any questions. We also have a free weekly newsletter you can subscribe to at redchip.com, featuring emerging growth companies like 60 Degree Pharma. In addition to our newsletter, you can also order your copy of Small Stocks, Big Money. This is a book written by RedChip CEO, featuring interviews with some of the biggest players in the microcap space. Order your copy at Amazon.com today for just $18. Now let's move on to our next interview today with Reviva Pharmaceuticals.
We're here today, back in the studio with Dr. Laxminarayan Bhatt, the CEO, founder, and formulator of 2 novel molecules, trading on Nasdaq under the ticker RVPH, Reviva Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Bhatt, welcome back.
Thanks for having me here, Todd.
It's always a pleasure, and it's very pleasant that since the last meeting back in the fall, the stock's nearly doubled in price, showing a positive trend. Do you think the market's starting to recognize some of your phase 3 schizophrenia trial progress?
I believe so, and there are a couple of things I believe. that impacted our recent surge in market cap. We are making good progress with our phase 3 study in schizophrenia, and we are communicating that one in periodically to our investors. And then especially recent announcement of our drug-drug interaction safety data, I believe the investors recognize that potential benefit to patients with the data. And then also we have strengthened our cash position. We raised additional capital a few months back that was participated by insiders as well as institutional investors. I believe that has impacted as well the positive development in the market cap.
Exciting, especially, want to congratulate you regarding the safety data. I think your phase 2 on 234 patients spoke very highly to both efficacy and safety data with some of the lowest patient dropout records in the history of essential nervous system drugs. So what do you think the FDA might view this new data as? How can it be a differentiator in your drug versus the current standard of care?
The schizophrenia treatment is in many patients is a lifelong treatment. To be compliant with the treatment, the patients, the safety is very important. So besides efficacy, safety of a drug play a critical role in the drug compliance. So the biggest unmet need in the treatment of schizophrenia is not just efficacy, but also safety, equally important. We believe we fill in that gap because our drug, based on the data generated prior to starting the phase 3 study in about 300 patients, our drug has demonstrated good efficacy and then safety profile compared to other widely used standard of care. And then recent the disclosed drug-drug interaction data that further supports that safety data already generated in the large phase 2 study. Just to give you a fact about how serious is safety in schizophrenia patients. So especially the drug-drug interaction, as we announced in our press release, about 25% of the antipsychotics currently in the market are known to cause drug-drug interaction. Around 50% of the drugs currently in the market are also known to cause drug-drug interaction. Most importantly, majority of schizophrenia patients, they are on multiple medications because they suffer from multiple disorders. So having clean safety profile for a new drug to be approved, that is, I believe, the most desired treatment along with the efficacy. So these two combination, we believe, our drug bring on table, and then this benefits patients.
Yeah, without question, this is exciting data, and everyone, I think, in this audience has some history of mental health between family, friends, co-workers, and a lot of the drugs, they work and they help. That's why they got through the FDA process, but clearly there are side effects, sometimes substantial. We went over a few in your last interview with hypothyroidism and weight gain, dyslipidemia, and right now you could say you haven't had these in the patients to date that you've reviewed the data from phase 2.
The onset of the schizophrenia in many patients, it's in early stage, teenage. So when the drug-induced side effects, when these patients take a couple of months to a year, so rest of their life, they have to take these medications. So for drug-induced side effects, we believe our drug not only addresses the efficacy, but also it can address to a great extent some of the side effects what we have seen with the current standard of care. That's the advantage, is the combination of efficacy and then safety. That is the biggest unmet need. I believe our drug is going to address that based on the data generated to date.
Well, a lot of anticipation. And last time we spoke, you mentioned looking for about mid-2023. Are you still on track? How's this phase 3 trial going?
We are making good progress. We are on schedule as we promised to our shareholders. We mid of this year, we promised we will give the top line data. Based on the progress made to date, I'm very optimistic that we will be able to give top line data sometime mid of this year.
Yeah, I noticed we spoke last time about Karuna Therapeutics, and they are almost a year ahead of you, I guess, and they had their data last summer, which had a profound impact on the market for them. It increased their valuation by approximately $3 billion, and they're continuing phase 3 and hope to have an NDA filed in the near term. Could this be the potential for Reviva and those out there looking for opportunity? Sometimes this transition between phase 2 data, which is important, phase 3 data often gets more market recognition, especially in the pivotal trial. Tell us a little bit more about, what your expectations are. Can you file the NDA based on some of this data, or, more studies, or what's the plan here?
Sure. The first of all, you mentioned the market response to Karuna Therapeutics data. I believe certainly that's a good, response, and then as anticipated, because schizophrenia market is very large, huge unmet need. Any new drug currently in development with positive data, one can anticipate that kind of market response. We believe in next about 5 months' time, when we have top line data, if our data is positive, we believe market would respond in a similar way for Reviva as well. If the drug shows good efficacy on secondary endpoints, that is the reflective of potential treatment benefit and faster recovery, and then leading to remission. I believe we have demonstrated in the phase 2 study. So only our phase 3 study that we anticipate in the next 4 to 5 months, that will reaffirm the data what we already generated. So we believe based on that positive note, the market cap should have similar to what you already mentioned, Karuna Therapeutics market cap on the top line data. We anticipate in similar line for our company as well.
I believe wholeheartedly in you, Dr. Bhatt. I know you're very humble, and you've designed this drug. You're seeing every day how it affects patients. Hopefully you're in line with phase 2, and I have very high expectations for your ability to change lives with this drug.
We strongly believe, our drug, brilaroxazine, has the ability to make difference in patients' life with the profile, clinical profile, what we have seen so far.
And this could potentially not just be for schizophrenia, right? There are other indications that have potential. Maybe you can touch briefly on that.
Some of the drugs, antipsychotics drugs currently in the market, approved for additional indications, because often in neuropsychiatric space, like besides schizophrenia, depression, bipolar, and ADHD, they are, to some extent, they are closely related or overlapping symptoms. So we believe, based on the clinical pharmacology profile of our drug, and then safety data, and then efficacy for primary endpoint and secondary endpoints generated, we believe our drug can be readily extended for additional indications, much larger market potential, such as major depressive disorder and ADHD. We will be able to take a right decision accordingly.
Now, to get more information on Reviva Pharmaceuticals, visit rvphinfo.com. You'll see research reports, fact sheets, presentations, and the latest videos. It's all free. You can even subscribe to email alerts to stay on top of the latest news. You can also call 1-800-RedChip to speak to a specialist if you have any questions. We also have a free weekly newsletter you can subscribe to at redchip.com, featuring emerging growth companies like Reviva. In addition to our newsletter, you can also order your copy of Small Stocks, Big Money. This is a book written by RedChip CEO, featuring interviews with some of the biggest players in the microcap space. Order your copy at Amazon.com today for just $18. Now let's recap the companies you met today. First, you met 60 Degrees Pharma, stock symbol SXTP on the Nasdaq. 60 Degrees Pharma is implementing clinical research programs to evaluate the utility of its Arakota regime for tafenoquine for non-malaria disease indications with an upcoming planned Phase 2b clinical trial in low-risk COVID-19 patients, expected to begin in 2023 and a second study to follow in 2024. Arakota is FDA approved as a malaria preventative treatment and has been on the market since late 2019. This solid foundation provides 60 Degrees Pharma a cost-effective path to new indications that capitalizes on existing research to reduce costs and risks. Then you met Reviva Pharmaceuticals, stock symbol RVPH on the Nasdaq. Reviva is a well-funded Phase 3 biotech pharmaceutical company with 2 platform drug candidates discovered in-house in its pipeline. Both candidates were discovered using the company's chemical genomic-driven technology platform. They have been granted composition of matter patents in the US, Europe, and various other countries. Again, to learn more about Reviva Pharmaceuticals, visit rvphinfo.com. Again, if you have any questions about any of the companies featured on today's show, call us at 1-800-REDCHIP or email us at info@redchip.com. In closing, remember, while small caps can provide significant gains, you must be prepared for the downside. Small cap stocks are among the most volatile asset class. Some of the companies featured on this show are RedChip client companies, and we may own stock in these companies. So please always read our disclosures at redchip.com.